Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everybody. And that was Dr. Bushra Barakat, our managing director, who introduced us. So thank you very much for being with us this morning. As you can see from the title, I think we're entering a new world. We're seeing some of it happening now, but I think it'll accelerate in the next decade. There's really a new global energy map which is emerging. And of course, I think we'll see more of it as we move towards COP28. So our organization is really meant to promote clean energy, clean technology across the region. We have some major partners and members. I hope you'll benefit from the day today to do as much networking as possible. This is the time really to get together to discuss the future. But as we do that, I think we need to realize a little bit of what's happening. And if you look at how much renewable energy has been installed, a massive increase, but it's still very small compared to what we need. And if you look at the recent period, 2020, 2021, and despite COVID, if you look across the world, China, of course, is by far the biggest investor in clean energy in all its variety, across all sources of clean energy, from hydro to solar to wind. And of course, what that means is that China, particularly, as well as Europe, United States, are developing technology that can be deployed globally. And if you look at the increase in the share of renewables, we've gone from about 20% in 2010 to close to 28%, 30% by 2020. So a large increase over a relatively short period of time. My view is that this will accelerate as time goes on. However, we also know that although there's been massive investment, we're reaching over 1 trillion in terms of investment in energy, of a variety of it. A lot of it is renewable, but we need to remember that it's not just investing in the energy. You need to electrify everything if you want to move forward and try to reach net zero emissions and the various targets. So a lot of the investment is taking place, but it's still very small compared to what we actually require. So 1 trillion today, but a variety of things are happening. There's a lot of hype around hydrogen, but it's still a very, very small fraction of total renewable energy and energy sources. So that'll accelerate as time goes on. In terms of financing, and I'll mention some of the numbers now, the opportunities in terms of various instruments are just developing right now. So in the session on climate finance, I hope you'll get the opportunity to talk about the new instruments which are arising in terms of green bonds, green sukuk, green loans, ESG type financing, while at the same time making sure that there is no greenwashing going on. So a lot needs to still be done on that. In terms of the financing that's required for climate action, I mentioned that we were close to 1 trillion last year. But if we really want to start addressing climate requirements and the climate challenge, by 2030, we need at least 5.2 trillion annually. We're very, very far from that. And if you want to achieve what we want by 2050, you have to maintain that for a long period of time. And these are in real terms, right? So if inflation takes place, then you will have to invest even more as time goes on. Hydrogen, of course, has an enormous potential. We know now that it can add to the sources of energy. There's still a lot to be done in terms of the uses of hydrogen. It is available, but we haven't developed the uses. We haven't developed the standards. What does it mean to be blue, green, gray, brown, etc., hydrogen? All of that needs to be put in place. You still need to put in place a market. So this is just to inform us that although there is enormous potential, you still have to establish a market for hydrogen. That's happening now. What will help, of course, is what we know in terms of the levelized, what we call the levelized cost of hydrogen. It's rapidly declining, and if you look at the expectations, it'll be able to compete with natural gas fairly soon. So if you look at the levelized cost, rapidly declining by 2030. So certainly a market and a source of energy that we will need to focus on. So what are the elements that we need to think of in terms of this new global energy map? One part is systems, and particularly electrification of end users. Another part is how you design the market and how you encourage flexibility. This is going to be increasingly important because once you go off-grid, you need to be able to have prosumers, production consumers who are also producers, like households, companies, and all the rest will need to join and be able to sell energy. That means that you're going to have to provide pricing, and you've got to provide access to the grid. Then you've got the enabling technologies, which are rapidly changing, starting from energy storage, batteries and the like. That's a rapidly changing industry with a lot of innovation. Electric vehicles, of course, will be a major element. But even if you do introduce electric vehicles and electric transportation, which is going to be a large part of the answer of clean energy, because transport itself uses up 15 to 20%, depending on the country, of energy use, you still need to ask yourself, how do I produce the energy for the electric vehicles? It's one thing to produce the electric vehicles, but they will require electricity. So how do you produce that electricity? So if electric vehicles are going to be contributing a lot, you need to make sure that their source of energy is also clean. So you have to look at the whole supply chain in terms of electric vehicles and transportation. Digitalization, I'll show that in a second. Digitalization really refers to the transformation that can come in the energy sector from using blockchain and artificial intelligence, whether it's at the retail level, the wholesale level, or in terms of the markets and how you actually produce. So that is a transformation that is starting to happen, but it will revolutionize the whole energy sector. So if you think of alternative intelligence in the excuse me, in the energy sector, it can really be what we call a ubiquitous general purpose technology, transforming all aspects of the energy space. So this is an area where, again, we're right at the beginning. So one word of caution or one word of recommendation from now is whenever you're considering whatever investments you're making in whatever area of energy, start thinking from now about what sort of alliance you want to make with artificial intelligence and IT, blockchain, and the rest. That's going to be a major area moving forward. It'll revolutionize and transform whatever you're doing. Okay, now this is an important slide. Why do I say that, and why is it that it's going to matter? If you think of what happened last year, a big shock, of course, to the energy markets. Russian invasion of Ukraine had a big impact on global supply chains, energy, food, wheat, and the rest. But at the same time, it came as a shock to many countries who realized their high dependence on one source of energy from one country, namely Russia. The net result of it is two things that happened. Countries became aware of the need for energy independence or energy security and for food security. At the same time, they said, well, what do I do as an alternative? And we're seeing now a big shift towards renewables, but also going back to known technologies such as nuclear and even coal and the rest. So we have really two forces at work. One is, how do I get increased independence and less dependence on one source as a country or energy? And how do I diversify? The net result will be, I think, a big change in terms of a shift towards renewable energy over the decade to come. But it also means that across countries, there's also beginning to be a big divide between advanced economies and countries who are able to make investments in renewable energy and less developed economies who don't have the means and to make the investments. What that means is that over time, you can have a big gap between developing economies who actually need it and who need to face up to climate change and the advanced economies. That could lead to eventually confrontation. So a big divide as time goes on. So we will need to address that, and I think many international organizations, World Bank, United Nations, and all the rest, are trying to face up to that, but we haven't really addressed it. In terms of policies, many new policies and targets have now been announced, but we're still a long way from pursuing those targets and achieving them. You're going to need much more in terms of market-based policy instruments that need to be developed, clear guidelines for credible transition plans and how you finance those. What I think it means is that as you go towards increased global fragmentation, as we go towards a decoupling, in particular between the US and China, I believe this is an enormous opportunity for this part of the world, for the GCC part of the world, because they happen to be geographically distant from both. They can address the requirements of China and growing Asia, but there's a big opportunity for this part of the world to go increasingly into providing green energy, renewable energy, through various means. So I noted right at the bottom that it's not only hydrogen, and we've seen already Europe, Germany, and others approaching countries in the region to get supplies of hydrogen and natural gas for a long period of time. But I think we need to think much further along. You can produce renewable energy in this part of the world through solar and then export it by linking up to Europe on the one side, India, Pakistan on the other, and also Africa next door. So the message, we're extremely privileged to be in the GCC, in the UAE, and Saudi, and the rest, because I think they will transform the global energy map as we move forward. Not only will they be able to produce and export fossil fuels and transform those fossil fuels, but they're going to be leaders in exporting renewable energy through alternative means. Currently, Australia is linking up to Singapore through a submarine cable to provide electricity produced cleanly in Australia. There's no reason why we cannot do the same by linking up the GCC countries into Africa, into Europe, through various grids, and into India, Pakistan. So that, I think, is part of the future we should consider. So the GCC, I think, will be at the center of a new, transformed global energy map, which is now being drawn. And if you think of why we need to do that, we know already that our part of the world is the most exposed to climate change because of desertification, because of the fact that 80 to 85% of the water that we use, the fresh water that we use, comes from outside the region. Think of the Nile, think of the Euphrates and other sources. We're using aquifer water in many other countries, but that, of course, is very inefficient and not sustainable. So increased desertification, higher water levels, increased heat. How many of you, for example, visited Kuwait or Iraq last summer? Temperatures reached 52 degrees, and I assure you, because I was visiting, you cannot really go out and live at 52 degrees. Everything collapses. That means that out of all regions of the world, the existential threat to our part of the world because of climate change is the greatest by far. So we're going to need to address that. And one way to address that is to look at subsidies. And if you look at subsidies in our part of the world, it's one of the highest compared to GDP of any part of the world. And it's not just the subsidies, it's the way we don't charge for pollution. We don't have carbon taxes. So not only do you need to remove the subsidies to using fossil fuels, you need to move to a new regime where you start imposing carbon taxes as we move forward. As you start doing that, that's going to require a whole transformation of manufacturing and industry that has been highly used to having very low prices for electricity. So a big transformation. So energy efficiency is going to become a large part of the investments that you will have to make. And if you think about the GCC policies, what the GCC can do, I'm a big advocate of not only making massive investments, as we've said, in renewable energy, but I think we should move forward and say that renewable energy should be part of foreign policy. What do I mean by that? If you look at the numbers, the GCC countries give as much foreign aid and assistance as many of the Nordic countries of the world, close to 2% of GDP. That's not a very well-known fact, because the GCC countries, Saudi, UAE, and the others, Kuwait, provide it, but they don't advertise that a lot. So it's not well-known. And because they're not members of the OECD, nobody collects this information, okay? Now, what I think needs to happen in terms of positive action is to make renewable energy part of foreign aid, so that we go to countries that we want to help and tell them, we're going to help you address climate change. We're going to help you in your renewable energy strategies and policies moving forward. So our companies who have been at the forefront in terms of developing renewable energy in the region can also be part of the foreign aid that is required in many of the countries we want to help. I'm not going to spend too much time. I'll just mention that water, of course, is one of the biggest challenges for many of the countries of the region. So what that's going to mean is that we need to focus on water management systems and how they integrate with clean energy. Energy and water go together. We know that in terms of desalination and water reuse, but very few people know that something like 45% of desalination capacity globally is in this part of the world. And we've been at it for about 20 years, 25 years already. The potential here is that by combining renewable energy, particularly solar, with desalination, this could be a major export industry to the rest of the world. So I just highlight that because, again, we need to be thinking of how do I become a major part of this global energy map, new global energy map. And desalination and related climate technologies are things that we've been doing, but we haven't thought about exporting them. It's starting to happen. I think this will accelerate. Final thing, climate tech. I mentioned desalination, but if you look at climate tech investment, it's starting to increase very rapidly. In terms of the Middle East, clustered financing is about 63% of climate tech. Climate tech, I think, is going to be a major investment area in the decade to come. So one of the things I think we need to think about together collectively is how do we invest more in climate tech, helping us to address one of the major challenges we have in the region. So it's not just about clean energy and clean technology, it's about climate tech and how we invest in that and what sort of instruments we have to do. So let me end there and just a recommendation. Let's try to emerge at the end of the day with a series of recommendations out of the various sessions. What is it that we need to focus on? And thank you once again for joining us. Thank you.